Hi class, I hope everyone's doing well and enjoying learning Java. So last week the assignment for Stepping Stone Lab 1 was to write pseudocode for the final project. After grading the assignments, I noticed that many of you were on the right track with your logic. However, there were just a few things missing, and so I wanted to kind of go through that assignment so that you guys have a full understanding, kind of solidify your knowledge and what the logic should be for this pseudocode. So the first thing I want to make sure that you guys understand is that before writing this pseudocode, it's good to think about what is the big picture, what's the ultimate goal. Let's put coding aside, all these programming languages aside, and let's just think about what is the goal. So for this final project, the ultimate goal is to have a list of recipes, a recipe box that can be modified. You can create new recipes, you can modify recipes, you can delete recipes, and each recipe can have ingredients that you can add or remove as well. So it's sort of just an organization for recipes. So when you think about the project, it's good to think about both the programming side and then also think about the user side. So back to the pseudocode, once we understand the big picture and the idea that we're just creating this organization for managing recipes, we can then look to see what are the details. So you can notice that there are three different classes: recipe box, recipe, and ingredient. So recipe box, seen here on the right, is essentially stores all the information related to the list or array of recipes. So each individual recipe is managed by this class. So this recipe class. So the recipe class has attributes: recipe name, servings, recipe ingredients, and total recipe calories, and also has all these methods, these helper methods. Ingredients is another class, and it also has its own attributes and methods. So these are three independent classes, but they are used by each other. So recipe box uses the recipe class, and recipe class uses ingredients, right? So your recipe box is a list of recipes. So these recipes are defined in the recipe class, and the recipe has a list of ingredients. So you see recipe ingredients. So each ingredient is defined in the ingredient class. Okay, so those are three independent classes that we're going to define. We have attributes and methods that we define, and these are going to be used by the main program. So the important piece of this assignment for the pseudocode, we're thinking about the logic. You want to start at the high level, right? Start at what is the user actually going to be doing. So that is defined in this application driver class. So if you see here in the below this UML diagram, it defines what the application driver class should do. So the application driver class should do a few things. So this is where we define and write the code and define the logic for how the user is going to interact with the program. So the user can do a few things, right? So the user can create a new recipe, it can add it to the collection. The user can view all of the items in the collection of recipes, and the user can give the option to either see more information about the item, so possibly looking at all the different ingredients of that recipe, or the user can actually edit the item, edit the recipe that's in the collection. And finally, the user should be able to delete a recipe from the collection. Okay, so this is what the user is doing. So the user doesn't see any of this information about how we're defining the recipe box, the recipe and ingredient class The user just wants to be able to create a new recipe, add it to the collection, view the list of recipes, possibly view the ingredients of a single recipe, and then to be able to delete recipes from the collection. So this is what we want to start with. We want to start here and be able to define these things. And this is where we should start with our logic. So when we start with the driver class, we will be using the different methods and attributes from those three classes that we have defined. These independent classes, sort of like tools, or tools that we can actually use and pull from as needed. But the main driver class, this is what we're developing. This is the core of the code, the core of the logic that will allow the user to do various tasks. So knowing that, let's look at a possible version of the pseudocode. So first, there's many different ways you can do this. There's not one exact way that, using the same exact terminology, there's no one right answer. There is one right way of thinking about it, way of logic, but there's no one right way of actually executing the logic. There's many, you can execute the logic in many different ways. So this is just one way, and I wanted to kind of go through this and give you guys an understanding of what was expected. So this is an example of what is expected, the logic that was expected. Again, you don't want to copy this verbatim or nothing like that. This is just the logic. So you can take this logic and then develop your own pseudocode that follows this logic. So again, the first thing we start with is the application driver class. So again, this is where we define everything that the user will be doing. And so the first thing we want to do is create a new recipe box. So remember, as you see here, the recipe box was a class that contains the list of recipes. So all we're doing in this first line is saying create a new recipe box object, and we're naming it recipe collection. So recipe collection will be the list of recipes that will store each recipe, and each recipe will have ingredients. So we're just defining it, we're initializing it. And the next step, we're saying while the user selection is not to exit. So basically the user is going to have multiple options. Remember, as we discussed before, the user can create a new recipe, they can view the list of recipes and edit a recipe if they wish, and then they can delete a recipe and from the list, and then they can exit from this program. So this is seen here. So if you see here, this is where we're actually displaying these options. Okay, so it's going to continuously display these options and execute some function based on the option that's selected by the user while the user does not select to exit. Okay, so this is the while loop. The while loop is usually used when you don't know how many times you're going to be running, iterating, repeating some function. So we don't know how many times the user is going to want to go in and create a new recipe or view the list of recipes or delete a recipe from the list. So this is why we use a while loop. A for loop is used when we know exactly how many times something is going to repeat. Okay, so this is why we're using a while loop. So while the user does not select to exit, we're going to display the menu, which is seen here. These are the different options. And then we just read the option from the user. So the user selects an option, 1 to 4, and we assign that to this variable, user selection. So it's important to use variables throughout your pseudocode. It kind of help you to connect the logic and see how one thing connects to the other, and trying to keep track of everything. So we have this user selection variable. So now that we know what the user selected, the next step is to execute some actions based on the user selection. So did the user select to create a new recipe? Or did they select to view the list of recipes and edit? Or did they just select to delete a recipe? I'm sorry, this should say delete the recipe from the list. Okay? Or did they select to exit? So now we have an if statement. So this is what this part is. We have an if statement that says if they selected option 1, then do something. If they selected option 2, then do something else. If they selected option 3, do something else. Selected option 4, then do something else. So this is where an if statement comes in handy. And this is the idea of branching. Branching allows you sort of to branch into different directions based on some condition. So the condition here is the user selection. So we're going to branch, if the user selected to create a new recipe, we're going to branch into this code. And this code is used to execute the action to create a new recipe and add it to the collection of recipes. So the first step, if the user selects to create a new recipe, we want to read the user recipe name. And notice this variable is coming from the variable that's defined as an attribute in the class recipe. So we're going to read the recipe name. There's also a servings, number of servings variable. So that's this, and this is also defined in the recipe class. And then we're going to create a new recipe ingredients list. So each recipe has a list of ingredients. And this ingredient, each ingredient is an object that is defined by the ingredient class. So recipe has a recipe name, servings, and it has this recipe ingredients list of ingredients. And these ingredients is the ingredient defined in the ingredient class. So the user will enter as many ingredients as they want. So again, we use a while loop. We don't know how many ingredients they're going to enter, but we know that they're going to enter ingredients. So while they're entering ingredients, we're going to read the name of the ingredient, the number of cups, number of calories per cup. And now, given this information from the user, we can now create a new ingredient object. And we're going to call that the current ingredient that they entered. And then we just insert this current ingredient into the recipe ingredients list. So remember, the recipe ingredients is a list of ingredients for this current recipe that's being added. So that's it. So now we have the recipe name, servings, list of ingredients, and then we can create the new recipe as a recipe object. So this is again defined by the recipe class. And we're going to use the recipe name, servings, and recipe ingredients to create this new object, this recipe object. And then we can insert the new recipe into the recipe collection. Remember, the recipe collection is the list of recipes, for our recipe box object that we defined at the very beginning. Okay, so that's it. So this is the section of pseudocode for creating a new recipe. This is just one way of doing things. There are many different ways to do this. The key thing is that you want to keep the logic correct. The logic here is that the user selected to create a new recipe, and we want to make sure we read in the proper information depending on the recipe class, its attributes. So you want to read in the right information from the user and make sure we read in the ingredients as well. So exactly how you do that is really up to you. Maybe you read all three of these ingredient properties at once. Whatever you would like. But the key thing is that the logic is there. The core of the logic is there. So the next section, the next if statement. So remember, we have an if statement based on the user selection. So the user has these four options. The user makes a selection. And we have an if statement, right? Branching. So we have an if the user selected option 1, we created a new recipe. So what if the user selected option 2? So now we have this other else if. So this else if the user selected to view the list of recipes and edit, so option 2. Then we have another set of code. So again, we have a while loop. The while loop states while the user wants to edit items. So this is going to continue to allow the user to edit items until they decide not to. Maybe they enter the word done and that stops them from, breaks them out of this loop. But the point here, the logic here is that they can continuously edit items. So once they edit one, I'll give them the option to edit again. They give them the option to edit again, and until they don't want to edit anymore. So inside the while loop, so when they want to edit an item, the first step is it makes a call to print all the recipe names. So note this is an actual method that's in the recipe collection class. So if you look at the recipe box class, remember recipe collection is an object of the recipe box class. So it has this property, print all recipe names. So it's going to call this method, and this method is going to print all the recipe names. So the user can then read, you can read from the user the recipe name that they want to view. So it displays all the recipe names. The user can then enter the recipe name that they want to view. And then if that recipe name exists, then we want to display that recipe's ingredients. So we make a call to the selected recipe, the print recipe method of this selected recipe. Okay, so this print recipe method again is defined in the recipe class. The selected recipe is an object of the recipe class. So it calls print recipe. Print recipe will be a method that displays the recipe's ingredients, its name and ingredients. So it's going to display the recipe's ingredients. So now that the user can see the recipe's ingredients, you can then display to the user the option to edit the recipe. So based on the user selection, if the user selects to edit, you can then call these various commands. The first command is called get recipe ingredients. So again, this is another method that's defined in the recipe class. It's a helper method that gets the recipe ingredients, gets the array of ingredients for that recipe. And you can see all this in the final project guidelines. You can see the recipe class, the recipe box class, and the ingredients class, and all of their different methods and attributes. So all of these are there. So then you can save the ingredients list as this variable, current ingredients. And then you can modify the current ingredients. So the user can then edit these ingredients. And then we can make a call to set recipe ingredients. So this is again a method of the recipe class. And because selected recipe is a recipe object, then you can set the recipe ingredients to this array. Remember, this array current ingredients is what we is the variable we defined as the ingredients list that was received after calling this get recipe ingredients method. So all we're doing here is the user selected to edit. So we're going into this if statement and we're receiving the current list of ingredients for that recipe. We're saving that list as a variable, current ingredients. We're modifying those ingredients based on how the user wants to modify it, whether it's deleting ingredients or editing an ingredient, whatever it may be. And you can even have more pseudocode that is more thorough and describes how the ingredients are modified. But this is fine just to describe the logic. And then you want to make a call to set the ingredients for the recipe with the new set of ingredients. So if the user selected to not edit, then do nothing. They're just viewing the recipe and its ingredients. So if the user did not select to edit, else, do not edit, do nothing. Okay, and then we have to make sure we close the end if, close this end if, and close the while loop. So remember, this while loop is going to continue while the user wants to edit. So if the user wanted to edit another item, it would go back to the top of this while loop, and it would again print all the recipe names, allow the user to select a recipe, and then display the recipe ingredients, and ask the user if they want to edit, and so on. Okay, so the last option that the user has is to delete a recipe. So we have this another else if the user selection is to delete a recipe from the list. Okay, and I didn't include the code here. This is for you to determine what this logic, the pseudocode should be, what the logic is. And else, if they don't want to, if they don't select the right option, right? So you have 4 different options, options 1 to 4. If they do not select the correct one, then it should display user selection is invalid. And that's it. We end this if statement and end the while loop. Remember, this while loop continues to execute this code while the user does not want to exit. So while it's not option 4. So the key thing here to remember is that we're focusing on the driver class. We're starting there. This is the main interaction between the user and the program. The user has these options. It can create a new recipe. The user can view and edit recipes, and the user can delete recipes. So we give the user the options, and based on the user selection, we execute certain code using the if statements. So that's the core of the logic. Now within each of these actions, we can make calls to our tools, the classes that we have, the recipe, recipe box, and ingredient. So these are the different classes that are used. And remember that the recipe box class uses the recipe class, and the recipe class uses the ingredient class. So they are independent, but they use each other. So it's also good, it's proper to define the pseudocode for each of the methods in the individual classes. So remember, we have the recipe box class. Remember, we called print all recipe names in the above pseudocode. So it's good to define what is happening inside that print all recipe names method. So in this method, all it's doing is printing each recipe in the list of recipes. So we have a for loop because we know how many recipes are in the list. So we can have a for loop that iterates through each recipe and first saves the current recipe as this variable, current recipe, and then displays the output of this current recipe, displays all the attributes of the current recipe. And it can do that by calling this method, get recipe name. So we're displaying the name rather than all the attributes. So for each recipe in the list of recipes, we're displaying the recipe name. That's all this is doing. So when we make the call to print all recipe names here, when we make this call to this method, it's calling this method. It's executing these statements. So it's good to define how it actually executes this command, print all recipe names. So I only did one method, but it's good to do each method, a pseudocode for each method in each class. I just wanted to give you an example. Similarly, with the recipe class, we have this method print recipe. So remember, we use that method here to display the recipe's ingredients. So what's actually happening inside this is that we are, for each ingredient and recipe ingredients, so this is the list of ingredients, we're doing something. So I didn't complete this because I want you guys to kind of think this through and figure out what would be here, but it should be pretty straightforward. For each ingredient and the recipe ingredients list, we want to display the ingredient. Okay, so we want to print that ingredient. So we can either make a call to maybe a method in the ingredient class, or we can just simply print all of the attributes of the ingredient. So there's different ways you can do this. Here's another method, get recipe name. So we also use this. So this is a helper method that just returns the current recipe name stored for that recipe object. So all this is doing is outputting the recipe name variable value. So just outputting the recipe name. So remember, we have these get methods and set methods. This just allows you to access the private variables within the class. So recipe name is a private variable within the recipe class. So this get recipe name allows us to have access and retrieve the recipe name. So again, this recipe class is independent of everything else, but it is used by the driver class and by the recipe box class. The recipe box class is also independent, but it's used by the driver class. So it's good to define what each of the methods in each class do. Okay, so I hope this all makes sense. Again, the main thing here is we want to start with the application driver class, the logic behind this, because this is what the user actually will be doing. This is how you define what happens between the user and the program, right? So we can start with this logic, which is defined here, and use the classes recipe box, recipe, and ingredient to actually execute each of the actions that we need to execute. So I just wanted to give you guys understanding the correct logic that was expected for the pseudocode assignment. And again, this is an example. The main thing to get from this is the logic. This can be done in many different ways, but as long as the core of the logic is there, that's what matters.